A quiet waitress wore her grandmother's perfume to work, never knowing it was a secret signal from a powerful family she had never met. When a feared Mafia boss smelled it across the room, he ordered the entire restaurant cleared, and her life changed forever. There are certain moments in life that look completely ordinary while they are happening. A routine shift at work, a quiet evening in a crowded restaurant, a woman applying a drop of perfume before stepping onto the floor to serve customers. Nothing about those moments seems important at the time. But sometimes, hidden inside something as simple as a scent, there is a story waiting to erupt, one powerful enough to change a person's entire life. I've always been fascinated by stories like that. Stories where destiny doesn't arrive with thunder or violence, but with something small and almost invisible. A glance, a memory, or in this case, a fragrance carried quietly through the air of a Miami restaurant. And tonight, before we go any further, let me say something quickly to you. If this is your first time here, welcome to Rose's Stories. This channel exists for people who are drawn to deep, emotional narratives. The kind of stories that reveal something unexpected about love, destiny, and the hidden lives people carry inside them. If you enjoy stories that slowly unfold like mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and it gives this storyteller the motivation to keep bringing you more journeys like the one you're about to hear. Because the story we're stepping into tonight begins in a place that should have been completely forgettable. Marcelo's restaurant in Miami. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind that slips quietly into the middle of the week without much significance. The kitchen was already alive with the low chaos that defines a restaurant before opening. Knives hitting cutting boards, the distant hiss of pans, the quiet tension of chefs preparing to feed people who expect perfection. At 4:47 p.m., Sophia Mitchell stepped through the employee entrance. She had arrived early, as she always did. That habit had formed over years of working jobs where punctuality wasn't simply professionalism. It was survival. Sophia tied her dark hair into a tight bun and secured it with a pearl pin. The same pin her mother had given her years ago, before illness began stealing pieces of the woman she used to be. Her uniform hung loosely on her frame now, the fabric slightly oversized from months of long shifts and quiet exhaustion. Sophia worked nearly 60 hours a week, not because she wanted to, but because life had demanded it. $3,200 every month. That was the cost of keeping her mother safe at Clearview Assisted Living. Earlier that morning, she had visited Catherine, just like she did every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Routine had become Sophia's way of holding the world together. When your mother's memory fades unpredictably, consistency becomes the only promise you can keep. Some days Catherine recognized her daughter immediately. Other days, she looked at Sophia with gentle confusion. That morning had been one of the better days. "You work too hard," her mother had said softly, hands trembling slightly as they always did now. Sophia had smiled the same way she always did. "It's okay, Mom. You're comfortable there. That's what matters." But there was something else Sophia had done before her shift began. Something that seemed completely insignificant at the time. Inside her locker rested a small crystal perfume bottle wrapped in dark velvet. It had belonged to her grandmother Victoria, the only grandparent Sophia had ever truly known. Victoria had given it to her 2 months earlier, during the final days of her life. Sophia could still hear the fragile strength in her grandmother's voice as she pressed the bottle into her hands. "This is important," Victoria had said slowly. "One day someone will recognize this scent. And when they do, you'll understand things about your family you were never meant to know." At the time, Sophia thought the words were simply the confusion of someone drifting between pain and medication. But that night, for reasons she couldn't explain, she decided to wear it. Just a small drop on her wrist, another at the hollow of her throat. The scent was unlike anything she had ever smelled before. Warm amber, old wood, something floral but impossible to name. It carried the feeling of history, like stepping into a place that had existed long before you arrived. By the time the restaurant filled with customers that evening, Sophia had already forgotten she was wearing it, until the moment someone across the room noticed. Because at 6:45 p.m., a man walked into Marcelo's and took his usual table in the corner. His name was Luca Ravellini, and the moment the perfume reached him, everything in the restaurant changed. And yet, Before we can understand why a man like Luca Ravellini would freeze at the faint trace of a perfume in a crowded restaurant, we have to step back for a moment and look at the life of the woman who unknowingly carried that scent into his world. Because Sophia Mitchell did not grow up believing her life was part of anything mysterious. If anything, her life felt painfully ordinary. I've noticed something about stories like this. The woman at the center of them almost never begins as someone powerful. She is usually someone invisible to the world around her, someone whose days are defined by responsibility rather than adventure. And Sophia was exactly that kind of person. Her life had been shaped by quiet endurance. The apartment she lived in sat on the third floor of an aging building a few miles from the Miami shoreline. It wasn't unsafe, but it carried the unmistakable signs of a place built for people who lived paycheck to paycheck. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television through the plaster at night. The air conditioner rattled when it turned on. The kitchen light flickered occasionally if she left it on too long. Still, it was home. And for Sophia, home had never been about comfort. It had always been about responsibility. Most mornings began before sunrise. She would drive 30 minutes out of the city toward Clearview Assisted Living, the facility where her mother lived now. The building itself was carefully maintained, with clean hallways and gardens designed to create a sense of peace for families who spent their days visiting loved ones slowly drifting away from the world. The staff knew Sophia well, not because she caused trouble or demanded attention, but because she came so often, 3 times a week without fail. Monday, Wednesday, Saturday. Consistency mattered to Sophia. When memory becomes fragile, routine becomes the closest thing to stability. Her mother, Catherine, had once been a strong woman. Sophia remembered childhood evenings where Catherine seemed capable of solving any problem that appeared in front of them. Broken appliances, school issues, bills that arrived earlier than expected. Catherine handled everything with a quiet determination that made Sophia believe nothing in life could truly defeat her. But illness has a way of rewriting those beliefs. The disease that had slowly taken hold of Catherine's mind did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, first through small moments of forgetfulness, then through confusion that lingered longer each month. Eventually, it began stealing the simple things: names, places, the order of days in a week. Some visits were still good ones. There were mornings when Catherine recognized her daughter immediately and smiled with the warmth Sophia remembered from childhood. But there were other days when Catherine studied Sophia's face politely, as if trying to place someone she had met once before but couldn't quite remember where. On those days, Sophia simply held her hand and talked anyway. It was easier not to show how much those moments hurt. When people talk about sacrifice, they often imagine dramatic choices. But the reality is usually quieter than that. It looks like working double shifts without complaint. It looks like calculating whether you can afford to buy groceries after paying a medical bill. $3,200 every month. That was the cost of keeping Catherine at Clearview. Sophia never complained about the number out loud, but she thought about it constantly. That was why she worked at Marcello's. That was why she stayed late when other servers went home. That was why exhaustion had become such a familiar companion. The only person who had ever spoken to Sophia, as if her life might contain something larger than this quiet struggle, had been her grandmother Victoria. Victoria Mitchell was not the type of woman who told long stories about the past. She carried herself with a calm reserve that sometimes made Sophia feel as though there were entire chapters of family history that had simply been locked away. When Sophia was younger, she had asked questions about relatives, cousins, uncles, the kinds of extended family other children seemed to have. Victoria would smile softly and change the subject. At the time, Sophia assumed it was because there simply wasn't much family left. Now, looking back, it felt more like deliberate silence. But Victoria had not been entirely silent. There had been that final afternoon. The hospice room had been quiet except for the faint hum of medical equipment. Victoria looked smaller than Sophia remembered, the illness having taken most of her strength. Yet when she reached for the small crystal bottle on the bedside table, her hand was steady. She placed it carefully in Sophia's palm. The glass felt cool and heavy for something so small. This belonged to someone important, Victoria said, her voice thin but clear. Sophia turned the bottle slightly, watching the light catch along the delicate edges of the crystal. "What is it?" she asked. Victoria studied her for a long moment. as if deciding how much to say. "It's a message," she answered quietly. Sophia frowned. "A message for who?" Victoria's lips curved into a faint smile that Sophia would not understand until much later. "For the person who recognizes it." And with that, the bottle became part of Sophia's life without her realizing what it truly represented. Because sometimes the most dangerous secrets are not the ones we discover. They are the ones we inherit without even knowing it. And sometimes those inherited secrets wait for years in complete silence, until a single moment forces them into the open. The dining room at Marcello's had never felt strange to Sophia before. Restaurants have their own rhythm, their own predictable choreography. Waiters glide between tables, glasses clink softly, conversations blend together into a comfortable background noise. For someone who spends enough time working in that environment, it becomes almost mechanical. But that night, something in the air had shifted. Sophia noticed it the moment Luca Ravellini stood from his seat. There was nothing aggressive about the way he moved. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture. Yet somehow, within minutes of his quiet instruction to the manager, the restaurant began emptying as if the evening itself had been canceled by an invisible signal. Couples gathered their coats with puzzled expressions. Businessmen finished their drinks quickly before leaving. The waitstaff disappeared into the kitchen without asking questions. If you have ever witnessed the subtle way real power operates, you know exactly what that looks like. It does not shout. It simply assumes obedience. Within 5 minutes, the room that had been full of conversations and music became unnervingly silent. Candles flickered on abandoned tables. The soft jazz that usually filled the space continued playing, but now it sounded distant and hollow. Sophia stood near the center of the dining floor, still holding her order notepad in one hand. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew instinctively that whatever was about to unfold had nothing to do with normal restaurant service. Luca Ravellini walked toward her slowly. Up close, he looked even more striking than he had from across the room. Tall, composed, his dark hair carefully combed back from a sharp brow. The suit he wore was tailored with the kind of precision that suggested money without ever announcing it loudly. But what Sophia noticed most were his eyes. They were focused on her with an intensity that made the rest of the room feel irrelevant. "You're going to stand there," he said calmly, "and you're not going to speak until I ask you a question." It wasn't threatening. It wasn't even particularly loud, but it carried the kind of authority that made refusal feel impossible. Sophia nodded. For a moment Luca said nothing. He simply studied her, as if he were examining something fragile and difficult to understand. Then he closed his eyes and inhaled. I've thought about that moment many times while reflecting on stories like this. Recognition rarely announces itself dramatically. Often it appears in silence, in the subtle shift of someone realizing that a memory they thought was buried has suddenly returned. When Luca opened his eyes again, something had changed. The calm mask he had worn earlier had cracked just enough to reveal something beneath it. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Sophia blinked, confused. "Get what?" "The perfume." The question caught her off guard. "My grandmother gave it to me," she replied cautiously. Luca's expression tightened slightly. "Your grandmother's name?" It wasn't phrased as a question. Sophia hesitated for half a second before answering. "Victoria." For the first time since he approached her, Luca looked away. He turned toward the tall windows overlooking the street outside, his hand resting against the frame as though he suddenly needed something solid to hold on to. The silence that followed stretched longer than Sophia expected. Then he spoke again. "Say it again." "Victoria Mitchell," Sophia said quietly. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. Luca's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. He remained facing the window for several seconds before finally turning back toward her. When he did, the look in his eyes had shifted from curiosity to something far more complicated. Shock, recognition, maybe even disbelief. "She had blue eyes," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Dark blue. And when she was thinking about something important, her hands would tremble slightly." Sophia felt a chill move through her. "Yes," she said. Luca stepped closer, not aggressively, but with the careful focus of someone trying to confirm that what he was seeing was real. "You have her face," he murmured. "The same structure. I didn't see it at first, but now it's obvious." Sophia instinctively stepped back. "I think you're confusing me with someone else." "No," Luca said quietly. He returned to the table and sat down again. though his composure looked far less controlled than before. Then he asked the question that finally made Sophia realize the night had taken a turn she could never undo. What was your grandmother's maiden name? Sophia swallowed. Castillo. Luca repeated the word slowly, as if testing its weight against a memory he had carried for years. Castillo. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment before looking at her again. Sit down, Sophia. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair across from him. Because something in the way he said her name made it clear that the conversation they were about to have would change everything she believed about her past. And perhaps more importantly, everything she thought she understood about herself. And that was the moment when the story Sophia believed she had been living quietly for 26 years began to unfold into something much larger than she had ever imagined. Luca did not explain everything immediately that night. In fact, after asking those final questions, he seemed to realize that whatever truth he was about to reveal carried consequences neither of them had prepared for. Instead, he placed a small business card on the table and told Sophia that if she wanted answers, she should call the number the next morning. Then he unlocked the doors of Marcello's and let her walk back into the Miami night as if nothing unusual had happened. But anyone who has ever discovered a crack in the story of their own life knows what happens next. Sleep becomes impossible. Sophia returned to her small apartment sometime after midnight. The city outside was quiet, but her mind refused to settle. Luca's reaction replayed itself over and over in her thoughts. The way he had said her grandmother's name. The way the single word Castillo seemed to land in the room like a forgotten piece of history. Eventually, she opened her laptop. Curiosity can be a dangerous instinct, but it is also one of the most human ones we possess. When someone suggests that your past may contain a secret, it becomes almost impossible not to start looking for it. Sophia began with the obvious search. Luca Ravellini. The internet did not offer much. A few scattered news articles appeared in the results, most of them vague and cautious in their wording. His name appeared alongside phrases like ongoing investigations and suspected financial networks. There were references to business interests in Miami, but none of the articles described exactly what those businesses did. What struck Sophia most was how little information existed about someone who clearly possessed enormous influence. People like Luca, she realized, lived in a strange space between visibility and absence. Public enough to be known, private enough to remain undefined. After an hour of searching, Sophia shifted her attention to the name that had triggered Luca's reaction. Ravellini. The results changed immediately. The Ravellini name appeared in older records, property documents, corporate filings, and a handful of society articles from decades earlier. One name appeared repeatedly. Isabella Ravellini. Sophia leaned closer to the screen as she read. Isabella had once been known as a reclusive perfumer whose creations were never sold publicly. According to the article, she produced fragrances exclusively for members of her family and a small circle of associates. Each perfume was described as unique, created through formulas passed down through generations. The brand name attached to those perfumes caught Sophia's attention immediately. Perfume Ravellini. Her eyes drifted toward the edge of the desk where the small crystal bottle now sat beside her laptop. The realization felt almost surreal. That perfume had never been meant for ordinary circulation, which meant her grandmother had possessed something far more significant than a sentimental gift. Sophia continued reading. The next discovery came hours later, buried inside a genealogical database she had never used before. Victoria Castillo. The screen displayed a marriage certificate dated more than 40 years earlier. Victoria Castillo had once been married to a man named Marco Ravellini. Sophia stared at the record for several seconds without moving. Until that moment, the name Castillo had been little more than a forgotten detail from her grandmother's past. A surname that appeared occasionally in old photographs and documents, but had never been explained. Now it connected directly to the Ravellini family. And when people encounter discoveries like that, something changes inside them. At first, the reaction is curiosity. But curiosity has a way of transforming into something else. Fear. Because once you realize your past may contain secrets, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why were those secrets hidden in the first place? Sophia continued digging. The records suggested that Victoria's marriage to Marco Ravellini had ended decades earlier. After the divorce, Victoria seemed to vanish from public records entirely for several years before reappearing under a new name. Victoria Mitchell, living quietly, working ordinary jobs, raising a daughter, Sophia's mother. The timeline became clearer the more Sophia studied it. Victoria had left the Ravellini world completely. She had changed her name and built a new life far away from whatever that family represented. And she had never spoken about it. Sophia sat back in her chair as dawn slowly began to color the sky outside her window. For most of her life, she had believed her family history was simple. Now it looked like something entirely different. She picked up Luca's business card from the table. One name, one phone number, nothing else. And this is something I have noticed in nearly every story about hidden identity. At some point, the person who discovers the truth faces a quiet decision. They can close the door again and pretend nothing has changed. Or they can walk forward and uncover the rest of the story. At exactly 10 o'clock that morning, Sophia dialed the number. Luca Ravellini answered on the first ring. "You've been researching," he said calmly. It wasn't a question. Sophia felt the strange sensation of stepping deeper into something she did not yet understand. "Yes." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Luca spoke again, his voice steady but unmistakably serious. "Good," he said. "Because what I'm about to tell you is going to explain why your grandmother spent her entire life trying to keep you hidden." And the truth Luca promised to explain would not only reshape Sophia's understanding of her family, it would quietly pull her into a world she had spent her entire life unknowingly standing beside. The car that arrived 20 minutes after their phone call looked ordinary enough from the outside. Dark sedan, tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that moved through Miami traffic without attracting attention. But the moment Sophia stepped inside, she felt the subtle shift that happens when you cross an invisible boundary. For the first time, she was not simply observing Luca Ravellini's world from a distance. She was entering it. The drive lasted nearly 40 minutes. The car eventually stopped in front of a gated estate hidden behind tall hedges and iron fencing. The property itself was almost understated compared to what Sophia expected. No extravagant fountains, no flashy displays of wealth, just quiet control. That detail struck her immediately. People who truly possess power rarely feel the need to advertise it loudly. Luca was waiting inside when she arrived. The room he brought her into resembled a private library more than an office. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that appeared to have been collected over decades. Tall windows overlooked a carefully maintained garden where the afternoon sun filtered through the trees. He gestured for her to sit. Sophia did, though the tension in her chest had begun to tighten. For a moment, Luca simply observed her, as if measuring how much of the truth she was ready to hear. Then he spoke. "Your grandmother was married to my brother." The words were delivered calmly, but they carried the weight of decades. "Marco Ravellini," he continued. Sophia had already seen the name on her screen the night before, but hearing it spoken aloud made the connection feel more real. Victoria realized very quickly that she had entered a life she did not want, Luca explained. The Ravellini family operated in a world she found unacceptable. Sophia watched his expression carefully. "You mean organized crime?" she said quietly. Luca did not deny it. "Yes." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Our family built financial networks, transportation operations, and businesses that exist in places where the law does not always reach. Some people call it criminal. Others call it survival." Sophia felt the gravity of those words settle in the room. "And my grandmother left. She ran," Luca said calmly. "And she was right to do so." That admission surprised Sophia more than anything else. "I don't blame her," Luca continued. "Victoria wanted a normal life. A life where her children wouldn't grow up inside the structure my family had created." Sophia's thoughts moved immediately to her mother. "Catherine." Luca nodded. "She was born after Victoria left. My brother never knew about the pregnancy until years later." The statement hung in the air between them. Sophia felt the slow realization spreading through her mind. "My mother is Marco Ravellini's daughter." For a moment Sophia said nothing, because once that fact settled into place, everything else followed naturally. "You're saying that?" "Yes," Luca said quietly. "You are part of the Ravellini bloodline." There it was, the invisible thread that had existed beneath her entire life. For 26 years Sophia had believed she existed outside the world of wealth and influence. She had served drinks to powerful people without ever imagining she might belong to their world in some distant way. Now she was learning that her grandmother had spent decades carefully protecting her from it. Sophia looked down at her hands. "Why are you telling me all this?" Luca's answer came without hesitation. "Because secrets eventually become dangerous." He reached across the table and slid a folder toward her. Sophia opened it. Inside were documents related to a private forensic laboratory operating within Miami's corporate sector. "I want you to work there," Lucas said. Sophia looked up, confused. "Why would you offer me a job?" "Because the moment federal investigators discover that you are connected to me, they will begin asking questions," he replied calmly. "They will attempt to pull you into their investigation. They will examine your finances, your employment, your personal life." Sophia felt a small knot forming in her stomach. "So this job protects me? It places you inside a structure where I can ensure your safety." Luca paused before continuing. "I won't force you to accept anything. You can return to your life exactly as it was yesterday. Continue working at the restaurant. Continue believing that the Ravellini name has nothing to do with you." He leaned forward slightly. "But if you choose to stay connected to this truth, then you deserve protection as well." Sophia stared at the documents in front of her. Her mind drifted briefly to Clearview, to her mother's medical bills, to the fragile stability she had been fighting so hard to maintain. Life rarely presents choices that feel completely clean. Sometimes both paths carry consequences. Finally, she looked up at Luca. "If I accept this job," she said carefully, "what does that make me?" Luca studied her for a moment before answering. "Family." The word carried more weight than anything else he had said that afternoon. Because in that moment, Sophia realized that discovering the truth about her past was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a decision, one that would quietly draw her deeper into Luca Ravellini's world. And once Sophia accepted that word, family, the quiet gravity of Luca's world began pulling her into a life she had never imagined for herself. The transition did not happen with dramatic declarations or sudden changes. It unfolded gradually, almost gently, which in some ways made it even more unsettling. Within 2 weeks, Sophia had left her position at Marcello's. The restaurant that had once felt like the center of her daily life suddenly became part of a chapter she was closing without fully understanding why. The new job Luca arranged for her was located in a private forensic laboratory on the edge of Miami's financial district. From the outside, the building looked like any other research facility. Glass windows, controlled entry, quiet professionalism. Nothing about it suggested the complicated network of influence that existed behind its funding. And yet the moment Sophia stepped inside on her first day, she understood that this place was different. The equipment was more advanced than anything she had expected. The technicians spoke carefully, avoiding unnecessary conversation. Security was tighter than in most hospitals she had visited while helping care for her mother. Everything about the place suggested precision and discretion. At first, Sophia focused entirely on the work. That had always been her instinct when life became complicated. Work provided structure, something measurable and logical in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. But Luca Ravellini's presence in that world never remained distant for long. He visited the laboratory occasionally, though never in a way that disrupted the operations. When he walked through the halls, people acknowledged him with the subtle respect reserved for someone whose authority required no explanation. What surprised Sophia most was how different he seemed outside the tense atmosphere of Marcello's that night. Luca was not loud. He was not theatrical. Instead, he carried a calm composure that made people instinctively lower their voices when speaking to him. Sometimes he invited Sophia to dinner at his estate. Those evenings became windows into a world Sophia had never truly seen before. The guests who attended those dinners were not the kind of people who appeared on magazine covers. They were quieter, more observant. Businessmen who spoke in carefully chosen phrases, discussing investments and logistics in ways that sounded perfectly legal on the surface while hinting at something deeper beneath the language. Sophia listened more than she spoke. And the more she listened, the more she realized that power rarely reveals itself directly. It moves through implication, through what remains unsaid but clearly understood by everyone in the room. It was during one of those dinners that she met Franco Giardoni. Franco had the kind of charm that could easily disarm someone who wasn't paying close attention. He spoke warmly, laughed easily, and carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to social gatherings where influence mattered. But there was something about the way his eyes lingered on people that made Sophia uneasy. He noticed her almost immediately. "So you're the one Luca has been protecting," Franco said with a curious smile as he took the seat beside her. Sophia considered her answer carefully. "I'm family," she replied. Franco's smile widened slightly. "Yes," he said softly. "That's what he says." The comment might have sounded harmless to anyone else at the table, but Sophia sensed something beneath it, something measuring. Before she could respond, Luca set his glass down on the table. The sound was quiet, but the conversation around them stopped instantly. "Sophia doesn't need commentary," Luca said calmly. Franco raised his hands slightly in mock surrender, still smiling. "Just curiosity." But the moment had already revealed something important. Later that evening, after the guests had left, Luca asked Sophia to join him in his study. The room felt quieter than usual, the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the shelves of books. Luca stood near the window, looking out toward the dark garden. "You should keep your distance from Franco," he said without turning around. Sophia folded her arms. "Why?" "Because he's ambitious." "And ambition is dangerous?" Luca turned toward her slowly. "It becomes dangerous when it begins looking for leverage." Sophia studied his expression. "You think he would use me?" "I know he would." The certainty in his voice left little room for argument. Sophia stepped closer. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked quietly. Luca did not answer immediately. For a long moment he simply looked at her, as though deciding whether to reveal something he had been carefully holding back. Finally he spoke. "I've spent most of my life protecting things that belong to my family." He paused. "And lately I've realized something." Sophia felt her heartbeat quicken slightly. "What?" Luca moved closer, the space between them shrinking in a way that suddenly made the room feel smaller. "You don't feel like an obligation anymore," he said quietly. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "You feel like someone I want to protect." And in that moment Sophia understood something that had been growing quietly between them for weeks. Sometimes attraction does not begin with romance. Sometimes it begins with protection, with two people realizing that the line between responsibility and emotion has quietly disappeared. And once that quiet confession hung in the air between them, it became impossible for either of them to pretend that their connection was only about family or protection. But love in stories like this rarely grows during moments of comfort. It grows during moments of vulnerability. The call came late on a Tuesday evening, several weeks after Sophia had started working at the laboratory. She had stayed late reviewing case files when her phone vibrated against the desk. The number on the screen belonged to Clearview Assisted Living. Something inside her chest tightened immediately. The nurse's voice on the other end sounded gentle, but there was a careful tone beneath it that Sophia had come to recognize over the past year. "Your mother had a fall earlier today," the nurse explained. "She's stable, but her condition has changed. The doctors would like to speak with you." Sophia did not remember leaving the building. One moment she was standing beside her desk, the next she was already in her car, the city lights blurring past the windshield as she drove across Miami toward the facility. Hospitals and care centers have a particular silence late at night. It's not the calm silence of peace, but the quiet of waiting rooms and dim hallways where people sit with thoughts they cannot say out loud. Sophia found her mother's room at the end of the corridor. Catherine was awake, though the fragility in her expression made Sophia's chest ache. Illness had been slowly changing her for months, but tonight the shift felt more visible. Sophia sat beside the bed and took her mother's hand. The tremor in Catherine's fingers had grown stronger. For several minutes, they simply sat together without speaking. Sometimes grief does not arrive with dramatic emotion. Sometimes it arrives as the quiet realization that someone you love is slowly slipping into a place you cannot follow. Eventually, Sophia stepped into the hallway to speak with the doctor. The explanation was calm and professional. The fall had accelerated the progression of Catherine's illness. The medical team would now focus on comfort and stability rather than long-term recovery. Sophia nodded as if she understood everything the doctor was saying. But when she returned to the room and saw her mother sleeping again, the strength she had been holding together for months finally began to break. Without thinking, she reached for her phone. She called Luca. He answered immediately. "Where are you?" "Clearview," she said softly. "My mom, it's getting worse." There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. "I'm coming." He arrived less than an hour later. And what struck me most about that moment, looking back at the story now, is how quietly Luca entered the room. There was no dramatic entrance, no attempt to control the situation the way powerful people often do. He simply walked in, pulled a chair beside Sophia, and sat down. For a long time neither of them spoke. Sophia leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her hands covering her face. The exhaustion she had been carrying for months finally surfaced all at once. She cried, not politely, not carefully, the kind of grief that arrives when you realize the person who raised you is beginning to disappear piece by piece. Luca remained beside her the entire time. He did not offer empty reassurance. He did not attempt to solve the problem. He simply stayed. Sometimes the most powerful form of support is presence. Over the next few days, Catherine's condition stabilized slightly. There were brief windows when her mind returned with surprising clarity. During one of those moments, she studied Sophia carefully. "You look different," Catherine said softly. Sophia wiped her eyes and forced a small smile. "Different how?" "Happier," her mother replied. The word caught Sophia off guard. "Happier," she repeated. "Mom, nothing about this situation is happy." But Catherine shook her head slowly and turned her gaze toward the doorway. Luca stood there quietly, giving them space. "There's someone in your life now," Catherine said. Sophia hesitated before nodding. Her mother looked at Luca for a long moment, as if recognizing something that had been invisible before. "You're the one she chose," Catherine said gently. Luca inclined his head with quiet respect. "If she allows me to be." Catherine smiled faintly. "Victoria told me once that the perfume would lead Sophia to someone important." Sophia looked at her mother in surprise. "You knew about the perfume?" Her mother nodded weakly. "She said it would guide you to the place you were meant to be." The room grew quiet again. Catherine reached for Sophia's hand and squeezed it softly. "Just promise me one thing," she whispered. Sophia leaned closer. "What?" Catherine glanced toward Luca one last time. "Don't be afraid to love the life you've found." Those words stayed with Sophia long after the hospital room fell silent again. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive with dramatic promises. Sometimes it appears quietly, during the moments when two people realize they are no longer facing the hardest parts of life alone. And Catherine's quiet blessing stayed with Sophia long after the hospital lights faded behind them, lingering like a final piece of guidance from a life that had always tried to protect her. Several weeks later, on an evening when the Miami skyline shimmered softly against the dark ocean, Sophia stood on the balcony of Luca's estate and tried to make sense of everything that had changed. Life has a strange way of transforming without asking permission. Only months earlier, she had been a waitress counting tips at the end of long shifts, worrying about rent and medical bills, believing her life would continue in the same small circles it always had. Now the horizon in front of her looked different. The city lights stretched across the water, reflecting off the surface like scattered stars. Somewhere behind her, inside the quiet rooms of the house, Luca was speaking with someone on the phone in a low voice. His world still moved with the complicated rhythms of power and responsibility. But Sophia had begun to understand something important about stories like this. The past may shape the road we walk, but it does not always decide where we end up. She reached up and touched the small pendant resting at the base of her neck. Inside the delicate crystal vial was a single drop of the same perfume her grandmother had once given her. Perfume Ravellini. The scent had once been a mystery. Now it felt more like a bridge connecting 3 generations of women who had each faced their own choices. Victoria had chosen to run from a dangerous world in order to protect the family she loved. Catherine had spent her life trying to give her daughter stability, even as illness slowly stole pieces of her memory. And Sophia had been given something neither of them fully possessed, a chance to choose her own path, while understanding the truth about where she came from. She looked back toward the open doors of the house, where Luca stood waiting. For the first time, the future did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something to build. Sometimes the most powerful inheritance we receive from the past is not wealth, or power, or even secrets. Sometimes it is simply the freedom to decide what kind of life we are brave enough to live next. When you step back and look at Sophia's journey as a whole, it becomes clear that this story was never only about a mysterious perfume or a powerful man recognizing a forgotten family name. At its heart, this story is about the quiet power of choices, Choices made across generations, often in silence, often without recognition. Victoria chose to leave a life that felt dangerous in order to give her family safety and freedom. Catherine chose to spend her life raising her daughter with dignity despite the struggles that came with it. And Sophia, standing between the past and the future, faced a decision that many of us encounter in different forms throughout our lives. Whether to let the weight of our history define us, or to use it as a foundation for something new. What makes her story meaningful is not the wealth, the power, or the mystery surrounding the Ravellini name. It is the realization that every person eventually reaches a moment where they must decide what kind of life they want to build with the circumstances they inherit. None of us choose where we come from. We do not choose the families, the challenges, or the unexpected truths that shape our beginnings. But we do choose how we respond to them. Sophia could have run from the truth about her family, or she could have allowed fear to control her future. Instead, she chose to move forward with clarity, understanding both the risks and the possibilities in front of her. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Your past may explain who you are, but it does not have to limit who you become. Sometimes the most courageous decision a person can make is not escaping their story, but learning how to shape it into something better. So now I'm curious about your perspective. If you discovered that your family had a hidden past that could change your future, would you walk away from it or try to understand it? Please share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can see different viewpoints. And if you enjoy thoughtful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Rose's Stories to support the channel and help us continue bringing you more powerful narratives in the future.